No alarms went off. No headlines flashed across the screen. Yet somewhere beneath the surface of North America's economy, something enormous just shifted. Factories are still humming. Workers are still clocking in. But behind the numbers, behind the noise, an invisible earthquake is taking place. Japan's legendary automakers, once the beating heart of America's car industry, are quietly heading for the exits. Not because they failed, but because America changed the rules of the game. For half a century, Japan's presence in U.S. manufacturing was the proof that globalization could work. Two nations, once enemies, bound together by industry and trust. But that trust is now evaporating. Years of tariffs, political whiplash, and economic nationalism have left even America's closest partners wondering whether the U.S. is still a reliable place to build the future. And as that doubt grows, a new winner is emerging from the shadows. Not a superpower, not a rival, but a neighbor, Canada. While Washington builds tariff walls, Ottawa is quietly building bridges. As America turns inward, Canada opens its doors. And that simple difference, predictability versus unpredictability, is redrawing the industrial map of the continent. This isn't just a trade story, it's a power story. A story about how one nation's attempt to dominate global markets might end up isolating it instead. Because every economic empire eventually reaches the same moment, the point where control becomes more important than cooperation. And that's where America stands today. What's unfolding right now isn't noise in the background. It's the early tremor of something much bigger. A shift that could redefine who leads North American manufacturing for the next generation. The question is no longer if Japan's automakers are leaving. The question is why they no longer feel the need to stay. The breaking point didn't come with one announcement. It came in fragments, a tariff here, a policy threat there, each one adding friction to what used to be one of the smoothest trade relationships in the world. For years, Japanese automakers endured it quietly. They adapted to new labor laws, navigated shifting currency rates, and absorbed the occasional political jab about outsourcing. But what began as background noise under the Trump administration has evolved into a full-blown economic obstacle course. The tariffs were supposed to bring manufacturing back home. That was the promise to rebuild the American middle class by punishing companies that left. But in practice, it did something very different. It made doing business in the United States unpredictable. And unpredictability in global trade is poison. Executives in Tokyo started running the numbers. Then came the reality check. Selling a car built in Japan to the U.S. market could now face tariffs reaching nearly 50% once you stack duties on steel, aluminum, and final assembly. That's not a tax. That's a wall. And no company, no matter how loyal to the American market, can survive inside a wall. That's when the first domino fell. Subaru's leadership quietly confirmed what insiders had whispered for months. The Outback, its best-selling model in North America, would no longer be produced in Indiana. Instead, that production would move home to Japan. On paper, it was framed as a strategic adjustment, but behind closed doors, it was a confession. Subaru wasn't retreating because of market decline. It was retreating because Washington's tariff maze made U.S. production financially irrational. The decision rippled instantly. The United States lost a key model. Canada gained leverage. Under the Japan-Canada trade agreement, vehicles moving north faced zero tariffs, a free, frictionless corridor. Meanwhile, cars crossing the U.S. border hit a tariff wall on both sides, one from Washington and another from Ottawa in retaliation. In a single year, Subaru cut its U.S.-Canada exports by more than half, from 26% to just 10%. The message was clear. The age of American stability was over. And when the smallest player moves first, the giants pay attention. Toyota, Honda, Mazda, Mitsubishi, they all began reevaluating their North American maps. The question wasn't whether to leave the U.S. entirely. It was how much longer they could afford to stay. Because this wasn't just about profit margins. It was about trust. The kind of trust that takes decades to build and a few impulsive policies to destroy. That's the real breaking point. Not the tariffs themselves, but the loss of predictability that every global manufacturer needs to plan the next decade. And as Japan's automakers began recharting their future, one destination kept appearing on every map: Canada. But Canada's rise isn't just a lucky coincidence. It's the result of something deeper. a long game of stability and quiet strategy that's finally paying off. What began as one company's reluctant retreat has now turned into a full-scale migration, slow, deliberate, and almost invisible. There are no press conferences, no flashy relocation announcements, just quiet adjustments buried deep in quarterly reports and logistics filings. But when you connect the dots, a clear pattern emerges. Japan's automakers are shifting their center of gravity north. Toyota, Honda, Mazda, Mitsubishi, the names that once symbolized U.S. manufacturing reliability are redrawing their North American maps. Assembly plants, once anchored in Kentucky or Ohio, are being rebalanced toward Ontario and Quebec. Research hubs once nestled in California are now sprouting in Toronto. Even supply chains from semiconductors to batteries are quietly realigning to follow. Why Canada? Because in a world of trade turbulence, stability has become the rarest and most valuable resource. Ottawa offers what Washington no longer can: predictability, no sudden tariff threats at 3 a.m., no policy reversals driven by election cycles. Canada's trade environment operates on a single currency. Global businesses crave consistency. The results speak for themselves. Analysts estimate that Japanese automakers lose around $25 billion a year from U.S. tariffs alone, and Toyota shoulders nearly half that burden. Every new tariff, every new round of political uncertainty makes the math clearer. The cost of staying in America outweighs the cost of moving away from it. Meanwhile, Ontario's automotive belt is undergoing something remarkable. Cities like Cambridge, Alliston, and Woodstock, once written off as relics of a fading manufacturing past, are buzzing again. New construction zones, expanded assembly lines, and retold factories are springing up with Japanese investment. In these towns, what once felt like the echo of decline now feels like revival. And this revival isn't being led by politicians or slogans. It's being led by pragmatism because corporations have stopped betting on proximity. They're betting on predictability. Even smaller Japanese brands like Subaru and Mazda are moving parts of their research and logistics to Toronto, a city now being described by economists as the Switzerland of North American trade, a neutral, stable bridge between East Asia and Western markets. And while this quiet migration reshapes the industrial map, its ripple effect reaches much farther. The cost of making cars inside the United States is climbing, not because of labor or land, but because of the very policies meant to protect American workers. Tariffs on imported auto parts mean that even cars assembled in the U.S. now carry the hidden tax of global friction. That means one simple thing for American consumers: higher prices, not just for cars, but for everything connected to them, from tires and brake pads to oil filters and electronics. The irony is striking. As U.S. consumers pay more, Canada gains more. As factories close in one country, they expand in another, and the more Washington tightens its grip, the faster capital slips through its fingers. But Canada's advantage isn't just in trade policy, it's in something much deeper: an identity built on reliability. And that identity, as we'll see next, is transforming not only Canada's economy, but its role in the global industrial hierarchy. For decades, Canada lived in the shadow of America's industrial power, the quieter neighbor supplying parts, resources, and labor, while the United States took the credit for innovation and scale. But that balance is shifting fast. The departure of Japanese automakers from the U.S. isn't just a story about tariffs or trade policy. It's about where trust still exists in a world that's running out of it. Walk through southern Ontario today from Windsor to Oshawa, and you can feel the pulse returning. These cities, once dismissed as post-industrial fossils, are now becoming laboratories of the future. Factories once covered in dust are being refitted with robotics, AI-driven assembly systems, and next-gen battery lines. And behind it all, Japanese capital is quietly flowing in, patient, methodical, and strategic. Honda's $15 billion bet on electric vehicle production in Alice single manufacturing investments in Canadian history. Toyota's Cambridge and Woodstock plants are expanding. Even battery suppliers from Japan and South Korea are following the trail, setting up shop near Canada's nickel and lithium reserves. It's not just an industrial revival, it's a realignment of global trust. Canada offers access to critical minerals, renewable energy, and perhaps most importantly, a political climate that doesn't swing wildly every election or cycle. When investors plan for the next 20 years, they're not looking for the loudest leader. They're looking for the safest bet. And in that equation, Canada has quietly become the new North American anchor for global manufacturing. Economists are already calling it a 21st century Detroit moment, except this time it's powered by clean energy, rare earths, and stable governance. The message is subtle but clear. If the U.S. wants to wall itself off from global supply chains, someone else will step in to build the new bridges. And right now, those bridges stretch from Tokyo to Toronto. But here's where the real twist emerges, because this revival, this quiet boom north of the border, is being funded by the very policies that were meant to protect American industry. And that brings us to one of the most bitter ironies in modern economics. Every protectionist dream begins the same way, with the promise to bring jobs back home, to shield workers from foreign competition, to make America once again the factory of the world. It's a noble idea, but the 21st century economy doesn't obey 20th century slogans. Trump's tariffs were supposed to punish China and force Japan, Korea, and Europe to produce more on U.S. soil. Instead, they created a ripple effect that pushed production elsewhere, not to Beijing, but to places like Toronto, Montreal, and Mexico City. The U.S. didn't repatriate factories. It just relocated them beyond its reach. Protectionism in theory protects, but in practice it isolates. And isolation in a globalized world is economic self-sabotage, because every tariff the U.S. imposes doesn't just raise costs for competitors. It raises them for American consumers and companies too. Toyota's vehicles made in Kentucky rely on parts from Japan, semiconductors from Taiwan, and batteries from Canada. Slapping tariffs on any of those inputs means Toyota pays more, which means American buyers pay more. And when that happens, the market punishes inefficiency by leaving. Canada didn't have to undercut the U.S. It just had to wait. Each time Washington fired off another tariff, Ottawa quietly offered an alternative, low-risk trade, predictable energy policy, and tax incentives for green manufacturing. In doing so, Canada turned America's economic walls into its own foundation stones. The irony couldn't be sharper. Policies meant to keep foreign industries out of America are now driving foreign industries away from it. And as Japan's automakers shift north, they're bringing not only their factories, but their entire ecosystems, engineers, suppliers, and capital networks. In trying to shield its economy, the U.S. might have just built the world's most expensive exit sign, and the rest of the world has started reading it. History has a strange way of repeating itself, not as an exact copy, but as a kind of echo. And if you listen closely, you can hear that echo right now. In the 1980s, America faced a similar crossroads. Japan's car makers, Toyota, Honda, Nissan, were flooding the U.S. market with efficient, reliable cars that Detroit couldn't match. Washington panicked. Politicians demanded tariffs. They spoke of buying American. Sound familiar? Back then, Japan responded not by retreating, but by building. They set up factories inside America in states like Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee. The result, jobs, innovation, and a new golden age of competition that ultimately made the U.S. auto market stronger. But this time, the echo feels different. Today's Japan isn't building inside America, it's building around it. The trust that once brought factories to the U.S. has eroded, replaced by caution and uncertainty. The same cycle that began with optimism in the 1980s is now closing with hesitation in the 2020s. Back then, America was the partner. Now, it's the risk. Economists call it policy, whiplash. Investors call it instability. But to historians, it's something even deeper. The moment when empire confidence turns into empire nostalgia. Think of Britain in the 1950s, France in the 1970s, or Russia after the Soviet collapse. Each believed its industrial core was untouchable until policy arrogance turned strength into fragility. Trump's tariffs are not the sole cause, but they are the symbol. The moment America looked inward when the rest of the world was moving outward, that's the echo. And like all echoes, it grows quieter with distance until one day it fades entirely. But before that happens, something even larger is beginning to take shape. A global realignment that could redefine not just trade, but power itself. The movement of Japan's automakers is more than a corporate decision. It's a signal, a subtle but seismic shift in how nations are reorganizing the global economy. At the center of it is a single question. Who do you trust to build the future with? For Japan, that answer used to be simple: America. The two shared decades of military alliance, financial interdependence, and cultural exchange. But alliances built in the Cold War aren't guaranteed in the climate war or the AI race or the EV revolution. Now trust is being rebuilt along new lines: cleaner energy, geopolitical neutrality, and supply chain security. And that's where countries like Canada, South Korea, and even parts of Europe are stepping in. This realignment isn't ideological, it's practical. Nations are no longer choosing sides between East and West. They're choosing stability over chaos. And in this new order, the U.S. is slowly losing the gravitational pull it once had. Every trade wall it builds weakens its orbit. Every tariff it imposes nudges another ally toward diversification. Meanwhile, China is tightening its web through the Belt and Road Initiative. Europe is deepening ties with Asia to secure critical minerals. And Japan, ever the quiet strategist, is weaving its alliances not through speeches or sanctions, but through factories, ports, and long-term contracts. This is what global power looks like in the 21st century. Not military bases or slogans, but production lines, energy corridors, and digital dependencies. And as America's policies push its allies to adapt, a new multipolar world is taking shape. One where power isn't declared, it's distributed. For decades, Washington defined the rules of globalization. Now the game is changing, and for the first time in generations, America isn't writing the next chapter alone. But that leads us to a final urgent question. What happens when the world stops waiting for America to catch up? Because that's where the next section begins. The reckoning that will decide whether this is a temporary setback or the start of a new world order. At first glance, this story looks like economics. Tariffs, factories, trade routes. But beneath all of that lies something more human, a question of identity. For over a century, America defined itself as the workshop of the world. Steel, cars, oil, microchips. It built not just wealth, but pride. Manufacturing wasn't just an economic engine. It was a social glue, a promise that if you worked hard, the system would take care of you. But somewhere along the way, that social contract began to fracture. Corporations chased quarterly profits instead of national resilience. Politicians sold economic patriotism while quietly offshoring production. And now when leaders try to rebuild that wall, they're discovering that the world they once dominated has learned to build without them. That's the real tragedy of protectionism. Not that it fails economically, but that it exposes something emotionally painful: the loss of trust between a nation and its own system. When Japan looks at Canada, instead of America, it's not just following incentives, it's following stability. It's choosing consistency over chaos, foresight over noise. And if America wants to lead again, it won't happen through tariffs, threats, or isolation. It'll happen through trust, rebuilding the faith that made the U.S. a global beacon of production, not protection. Because in this century, leadership isn't about who shouts the loudest. It's about who builds what lasts. And right now, the world is watching to see if America still remembers how to build. So where does this leave us? A decade from now, the North American map may look entirely different. Factories once humming in Michigan or Ohio could be running north of the Great Lakes. Japan's auto giants may call Ontario, not Tennessee, their second home. And America, once the gravitational center of the industrial world, could find itself orbiting the system it once created. But this doesn't have to be a story of decline. It can still be a story of awakening, because every empire at some point is forced to choose between doubling down on fear or rediscovering what made it strong. For the United States, that means confronting the limits of protectionism and embracing the power of partnership again, not as dependency, but as design. History's echo is ringing again. The only question is whether America will hear it or ignore it until it fades for good. And that's why this moment matters. Not just for politicians or CEOs, but for everyone who still believes the American economy can be more than a slogan. If you found this breakdown insightful, make sure you're subscribed, because the shifts we're seeing right now, from Japan to Canada, from tariffs to trust, are only the beginning of a much larger global transformation. Stay curious, stay critical, and I'll see you in the next deep dive.